Morning. Now, I confess to you all that this is not the longest sermon I've ever prepared. When Reverend Jennings scheduled with me to do this, we were still planning to have the church picnic afterwards, so I thought it would be appropriate to share shorter remarks. If anyone feels otherwise, feel free to give me a call later and I'll make it up to you. Right. Those of you who share with me a wry sense of humor may be familiar with the British comedy group Monty Python. For those unfamiliar, the group is known for a comedy sketch show that first aired in the early 1970s on the BBC and later across the pond here. And eventually they produced some movies and some live acts as well. The sketches were dry-witted and, frankly, absurd satire. In one of the more famous sketches, a character in a mundane English household set in the early 1900s becomes irritated at being questioned by another character. He then sarcastically shouts that he didn't expect some kind of Spanish Inquisition. Well, suddenly from stage right, three characters dressed in red, like Roman Catholic cardinals, burst in. The leader, supposedly Cardinal Jimenez, brought forward a few centuries, delivers the famous line, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition." Now, if you haven't seen it, what you need to know is this. He then attempts to intimidate the other characters by listing the Inquisitor's three weapons. But he ends up saying four things, not three. He grimaces and then restarts his speech by saying they have four weapons. He bungles it again and asks to restart the sketch, which the other actors do so he can burst in and restart the speech again. And this cycle of buffoonery repeats itself. If you're wondering where this is going, here it is. The ultimate point of the satire aside, the comic device of this cardinal correcting his own speech while still speaking and restarting comes to mind when I read this passage from 1 Corinthians and Paul suddenly tries to figure out how many people he's baptized. I think Rebecca and I were reading this the same way. Now, 1 Corinthians follows a common format in the ancient world for writing letters. And beginning here in chapter 1, verse 10, Paul delivers what would be his main thesis. It's an appeal for unity in the church. Paul explains why he makes the appeal, reports of divisions, and he cites his source, as would be appropriate in the context, someone from Chloe's household. Now, as an aside, we don't know a lot about Chloe. She may have been a well-to-do businesswoman, and apparently she or someone working for her counted as a reliable, credible source for Paul and for his audience in Corinth. That it is Chloe and not, say, Carl might warrant its own sermon, but I digress. Paul asks rhetorically, even sarcastically, if Christ were divided. And I believe that here we find a little bit of accidental humor in the text. So often we act like reverence and respect must be only solemn, but that just isn't what I see here. Now, Paul's making a serious point. We're baptized into the one Christ, not into the various human leaders who conduct the baptism. It's likely that Paul dictated this letter to a scribe. Paul says what would support his argument, and I can't help but imagining this exchange with his scribe, something like this. Paul is saying, "I didn't baptize any of you." And the scribe's writing and looks up and says, "Well, what about Crispus and..." Paul's face changes. "Except Crispus and Gaius. Anyway, no one can say they were baptized into my name." The scribe gets that down, looks up again. "What about Stephanus's people?" "Yes, I also baptized Stephanus's household." And I imagine Paul then wrinkling his face in frustration at this distraction from the point he was trying to make. Beyond that, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else. Christ didn't send me to baptize, and so on. getting back on track. And what I love here, the scribe faithfully writes down each of Paul's concessions, culminating with the admission that he doesn't actually remember. Wait, how many weapons do the inquisitors have in the sketch? 3, 4, more? Does it matter? The point is something else. And like any of us will do from time to time, Paul fumbles around for a moment on his way there. We can give Paul and ourselves the grace to laugh and deal with serious matters at the same time. Now, Corinth was a cosmopolitan town. It was located on an isthmus. Of course, you may know that an isthmus is a fun word to try to say 10 times quickly. And it's also a narrow strip of land connecting two larger land masses. The city lay on an important land route in Greece, and due to geography, it would also have been relatively easy to reach safely by boat. Besides cults of personality, economic disparities also divided the Corinthian Christians. Elsewhere in the letter, we learned there were scandals over personal conduct of some of the members of the church, and when they came together for worship or for communion, as we are doing this morning, they had different ideas about how to use their spiritual gifts, and things sort of went off the rails, so to speak. Now, by the way, later in 1 Corinthians, you get to the chapter 13, the famous chapter on love that you so often hear read at weddings. Well, this may ruin it for you, but it ain't about romantic love. Read in context, love is patient, love is kind, is about church politics. Maybe we should read it at our church business meetings rather than weddings. Well, now, marriage does involve humans trying to get along together and share power and resources. So you could say that marriage is inherently political. And framed that way, I suppose it still applies. You're welcome. Some of the divisions that Paul addresses can feel foreign to us today, but others are all too relevant in our age. Locally, nationally, globally, an obscene economic gulf separates us. Millions struggle for the basics of life and collect food donations, say, from their local Philadelphia recreation center once a week, while a smaller number collect houses and yachts. These divisions are visible both in the larger society and in church communities. And this brings me to the second passage in 2 Corinthians 8. On one level, yes, Paul is trying to raise money. It's part of the job. Beyond that, though, he articulates what I think is a beautiful ethical vision. To paraphrase, it's as if he says, okay, community A, right? When you have extra and community B is in need, share it. Then B will share with A when the time comes. If you don't have much to give, it's okay. I'm not shaking you down, right? Do what you can. Today, we might call this a sliding scale. It appeals to a sense of fairness and balance. And interestingly, while Paul remains firmly in his Jewish heritage here, some of his language around the balance or equality, depending on your translation, is closer to Greek philosophy than the Hebrew Bible. I think it is an appropriate fusion of the two for both author and audience. As a student of the Bible, I find that Jesus' teachings are mostly not very controversial. I don't think anyone actually follows all of them. Okay, let's be clear about that. But everyone seems to think they are nice ideals. No one really hates Jesus, Christian or otherwise. The really interesting and often really nasty fights among Christians often are about the correct interpretation of Paul's writings. And some people do walk away with a strong distaste for Paul. I'm sure you've seen it. It's as if someone takes a razor, slices out a single sentence from one of the epistles, and uses it to support their own agenda. Some examples are more theoretical in reference to communion. How literal or figurative is the statement, "This is my body"? You'll hear that this morning when we take the meal. Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and of course the Pope all answered differently, and Baptists tend to answer strongly on the figurative side, but we can debate that another time. With other examples, I shudder. Do you? When you hear things like, "Slaves, obey your masters, wives, submit to your husbands"? Never mind that the scholarly consensus is that Paul didn't actually say those things. Never mind that even if he did, at least in the latter case of the wives, the translation is, and I can defend this, irredeemably butchered. Never mind that the context also always affects the meaning. Never in my life have I heard, and I was raised in the church, never have I heard anyone hold up the line that there may be balance or that there may be equality. Often I hear a misguided Christian advocate for a law or a governmental policy based on a few words from the Bible. Never have I heard a call for a progressive tax policy based on 2 Corinthians 8. Now let me be clear, I oppose theocracy. Attempting to legislate directly from a religious text always ends badly, and tax policy isn't the context here. Let us not force our agendas into the Bible. But how do we allow these words from Paul to inspire us in the church? Yes, money is certainly part of it, but I think it's fair to include time and talent also. As the body of Christ locally, how can we support each other here at Second? What does it look like to share one's abundance with another and then back with the first? To share not out of guilt, not with shame, and not by putting your rent check in the offering plate. Rather, to share generously with a mind to equality and balance, and to receive graciously in a culture, our culture, that prizes self-sufficiency. I have been blessed both in giving and receiving here, more than I could describe in a short sermon, and I am grateful to many here and beyond these walls for that. And while our church picnic was rescheduled, that kind of shared meal is a small example of that kind of mutuality. As the body of Christ universal, as part of a global network of churches, what does it mean for us in the United States to seek this balance? What does it mean for a community of Christians in Southeast Asia, offspring of mission work from this congregation, this one, who are now caught in a brutal civil war? What does it mean for a Christian minority in a small seaside strip of land who by reason of ethnicity and geography are killed along with nearly 40,000 others by munitions our tax dollars, yours and mine, purchased? What does it mean in an overwhelmingly Christian population in the heart of Africa, where child labor, human displacement, violence, and environmental ruin are how we get cobalt and copper for our phones and cars and flying drones? What does it mean there? I could go on, but you get my point. And I don't have great answers, but I know we tend to find very little of the things we don't look for. Paul made his appeal to the Corinthian Christians for their unity and equitable generosity. In fact, he made multiple appeals. Not all his writings survive, at least two do. Paul also reminds us of his experience that God's power can come through human weakness. Paul lived this, and in a sense, so do these letters to Corinth. These letters did not magically transform the community of believers there. A generation or two after Paul, a bishop in Rome, wrote another letter to the Corinthians about some of the same issues. And around the world, 19 centuries later, we continue to wrestle with what it means to have unity with all our rich diversity, and how, with God's help, we can grow closer to each other and to mutuality and equality. Let us celebrate the unity we have and the unity to which we aspire in the communion meal now.